So the title of my talk today is kind of reflections on the cognitive and linguistic outcomes that my work and others' work has kind of seen up until now. And today's talk is definitely a journey where I talk about the work that I did as a graduate student and with Dr. Vad, who's on the call, and where I'm thinking this work can go, and just kind of my train of thinking, my train of thinking. But first, I definitely want to bring up this question of like, what is language brokering? Many of us are on Twitter a lot. You may have seen this Twitter thread where there's a cat being shown some documents, and people started responding like this. This one person said, "Oh, reminds me of my immigrant parents showing 10-year-old me documents they received expecting me to be able to fully translate." And if you've ever seen the movie Spanglish, you might be familiar with the scene where the daughter is having to translate for her mom very fast because her mom has some working knowledge of English, but she still wants the daughter to translate. And this phenomenon is called language brokering. Due to limited linguistic and cultural resources, many recent immigrants, particularly in the United States, often rely on their English-speaking children and adolescents to assist them in navigating the cultural and linguistic systems in a new country. And I need to talk about how this is a very important topic to me, because this was something I actually did as a child. And it's something that I actually continue to do for both of my parents, because they're immigrants from Mexico, and a lot of linguistic information they still want some additional help with. But we can talk about the prevalence. Well, there's no available statistic on how many kids actually serve as language brokers. We know that in the United States, about 25% of all children are children of immigrants. So that kind of tells us a little bit about how many, and that doesn't tell us how many kids are children of immigrants, or how many of those parents don't necessarily speak English. So I show this statistic to kind of tell us how important it is to understand these experiences. And at this point, you might be asking yourself, well, what do language brokers actually do? There are various contexts in which language brokering might occur, such as in this example, you might have to translate medical information or a diagnosis between the doctor and your parent. Also, in a parent-teacher conference, maybe you're having to translate that your younger sibling acted out and now they're getting detention, or maybe you're having to translate even in your own parent-teacher conference. And of course, when you're translating for yourself, you say, I'm the best student, I never get in trouble. But language brokers don't just interpret spoken information, but they also translate written information, such as legal and government documents, maybe filling out a job application or filling out a naturalization form for a parent. Additionally, language brokers also kind of have to broker at financial institutions, maybe help their parents set up a new bank account. Oh, this is going on itself. So that's requiring some sophisticated cognition. And previous work shows that there are some consequences for language brokering. So some of the earlier work kind of focused on sociocultural outcomes, such as family closeness, that this experience made children who had to broker and adolescents who brokered for their parents feel closer to their family. But it also heightened their sense of biculturalism. They felt close both to American culture, but also to their heritage culture, or feeling closer to their ethnic identity or enhanced ethnic identity, because they're having to engage in these interactions with their family and also other community members. One of the other prior areas of research also focused on emotional outcomes, where this is kind of shown where some brokers feel happy and proud about this experience because they're helping their parents, so they feel like they're contributing to their family's well-being. However, there are some negative outcomes where we find that language brokering experience might actually lead to things like depression and feelings of burdensome, especially if language brokers are constantly getting corrected or by their parents, or if it's in a high-stress situation. So as a graduate student, especially working with Dr. Bed, we both became really interested in, well, we see these sociocultural and emotional outcomes, but language brokering is if you think about it, it's a linguistic and cognitive experience. So we're interested, well, what about sort of long-term cognitive and linguistic outcomes? Because if we think about when language brokering experience happens, it starts about eight years old, or as it's shown in the literature. So this is a very important developmental time for children, right? So the goal of my talk today is to briefly overview some of my work on cognitive and linguistic outcomes on brokering, and then with some reflections on where I think this work could go. But also I want to open it up to discussion on like why I think language brokering is an important but also difficult phenomenon to study. So here I want to highlight cognitive outcomes on brokering. We know from Bialystok's bilingual adaptation theory that use and knowledge of more than one language leads to lifelong changes in cognitive and neurocognitive development that can affect how a bilingual interacts with, accesses, and utilizes cognitive resources. And we also know that variability among bilinguals leads to distinct cognitive and linguistic outcomes. So we would expect that there would be some distinct outcomes related to language brokering experience. So some previous work has found that language brokering is actually related to enhanced academic achievement related to standardized test scores as well as grades. And some of Vanessa Rainey's work has found that language brokering actually enhances cognitive flexibility. And in terms of my work, we find, in a previous study, we found that language brokering experience enhances divergent thinking primarily in the first language. And for these participants, it was Spanish. And in one of my recent papers, Mingyu Zhang, Maria Redondo, and Suyang Kim and I were really interested in not just the cognitive outcomes of language brokering, but we were thinking about, well, language brokering we know is an emotional experience. And we know that it may affect language proficiency in the first language, but how might this actually affect executive function? So we gave participants a assignment task, and we actually found that L1 proficiency and emotionality in how language brokers describe their experiences in relation to their mother actually led to very distinct effects in executive function performance. So what was really interesting was that we found that high and low Spanish proficiency in the L1 led to really divergent effects, which supports this notion that that research really needs to investigate the diverse experience of bilinguals. We didn't necessarily find that higher L1 proficiency on its own enhanced executive function, but we complicated the story a bit because we added emotion. And in terms of linguistic outcomes, some of my work has found that language brokering experiences lead to a more unified semantic organization. So when language brokers are thinking about category exemplars, they think of more similar items across languages. So maybe language brokering is even enhancing, or not enhancing, but affecting how closely related items are in the mental lexicon. We also find that language brokering enhances the ability to process phrases for their meaning. So language brokers, because of this experience, the minute they see linguistic input, may be already processing both literal and figurative meaning. Excuse me. And all right, so as you can see, language brokering is clearly a cognitive, linguistic, emotional, and social experience that requires bilingual language brokers to become accustomed to processing multiple sources of linguistic, cultural, and emotional information. And while most of my work, and here I want to take a moment and kind of pause and think about where my work has gone and where I think it could go or could go in the next few years. But in my previous work, I was really interested in comparing brokers to non-brokers, where I really dichotomized my sample. And I don't know if that's necessarily the best way to examine it, because it kind of creates this all or nothing category. And language brokering experiences may be variable. What language brokers there might be different contexts of brokering, and there might even be variation across the lifetime. And I'm also really inspired by Nick's talk a few weeks ago. We're talking about how qualitative methods can inform on quantitative methods. And this was something I actually started thinking about even in graduate school. So I was interested, well, what about just asking former brokers or current brokers about their own language brokering experiences? And do they realize what they're doing? Because I didn't know what brokering was until I met Dr. Beck. So in a recent study, we examined how language brokers actually viewed their own brokering experiences. And this is a recent paper with my colleagues, Estefania Lezama and Dagoberto Heredia, where we were really interested in how do bilingual young adults with early brokering experience perceive past informal translation experiences. And we asked questions, or we were interested in dimensions of context, such as context of brokering, language abilities, problem-solving strategies, if they maybe didn't know how to translate a word or a phrase. And I'll explain, and I'll go over the study briefly. So in this study, it was a descriptive qualitative study. We interviewed 10 Spanish-English bilingual brokers, all college-age students, and all of like Latinx backgrounds, self-identified. And what we had them do, was come into the lab and they answered a detailed language background questionnaire where we asked them questions on their age of acquisition, language use, as well as self-rated language proficiency, and their context of language brokering experiences. And then a week later, we brought them back into the lab and we did semi-structured one-on-one interviews where we asked questions like, what can you tell us about your overall brokering experience? We also had to explain what brokering was. So we said translating for your parents or interpreting. And we'd ask, did your feelings towards brokering change over time? And what kind of strategies, or what would you do when you didn't know how to translate something? We used grounded theory to generate themes of prior brokering experiences. And next I'll go over some of the quotes that we found. And all of the names are pseudonyms for these participants. So here we have Carmen, when we asked her about how was language brokering experience, how was your language brokering experience? She says, no, I related to you, or how was it to your identity, excuse me. She said, no, I guess it makes me me. When you see someone at a store that needs, and she meant help, I'm going to help them versus maybe thinking they can do it on, they can figure it out and walk away. It's maybe more like wanting to help people. So this demonstrates that for Carmen in particular, language brokering was something very integral to her own identity, but also this shows a level of empathy, right? Because she maybe had to translate for her parents, whenever she sees someone having some difficulty, she's more willing to step in and maybe help them in any way that she can. And here, I'll show Lorenzo's first quote, where we asked him, oh, what did you think, how do you feel about your translation experience for your parents? And he said, I'm not so great at it, I guess. I mean, I can translate, but sometimes I tend to struggle in translating. And then in a follow-up question, we asked him, but how did you really think about this experience? And he said, well, it feels good at one point because you're actually helping another person and trying to understand. They're asking you for help or translating because you're the only one who knows both languages. So in one short interview, Lorenzo changed his perception on how he thought about his own brokering experience. So what might have been difficult was especially when you didn't know a word, right? So that's more of a linguistic reason why he may have not liked the experience. But then when we asked him overall, he talked about how he actually liked it. Let's see. Our next one, so Santiago, when we asked him, did you see any advantages or benefits? And he said, well, my own language skills. And he said, I'm learning a third language right now. I mean, it's given me a doorway to other languages. So for Santiago, his language experiences were sort of motivation for learning another language. And a fun quote from him was when we asked him what sort of strategies or what would you do if you didn't know how to translate? And he said, I would sound out a word in English. I mean, think of it in English, sound it out in Spanish and go from there. So what Santiago was demonstrating is he was looking for a cognate, right? He was looking for a word that had shared form and meaning across languages. And this tells us something about the collaborative nature of language brokering. Because if he's talking to his parents or the person that he's translating for, he's hoping that they can understand what he's maybe hoping to say, and then they might work together to figure out what the best or the correct translation may be. And here we have Valentina who states, when we asked her about her brokering experience, she said, it made me feel really good about myself because I'm helping somebody, not like translating way, but helping them understand and motivating them to expand their language as well. So for Valentina, it was more important to her own self-development, but also she saw it as a tool to help others learn another language. And this is the last quote from Roberto, another positive sort of feeling about brokering. Said, generally, I would feel good about myself because I know both languages and I could go back and forth between speaking English or Spanish or vice versa. So the overall themes in this paper, we found that there were and I didn't have quotes for this, but we did find that there were different contexts as well as frequency of language brokering because they were college-age students. Many of them said, I brokered a lot more when I was living at home. But now that I'm away from home, I tend to broker mainly around tax season or if my parents apply for a new job. And many of them said, well, since I'm also away from home, my younger siblings are translating now. So it's kind of like the brokering responsibility has been passed down. And I want to highlight empathy here because that was definitely a theme we weren't initially looking for, but it came up in several of the quotes. So there's something to say here about language brokering experience that might actually make people more empathetic, maybe because you've had to deal with difficult situations with your family or with other community members that you've had to translate for. And what I think is really interesting is how language brokers have their own strategies. Like we saw with, I think with Santiago's quote of saying the word in Spanish, hoping that there was some overlap in English. But this also tells us that there might be some metalinguistic effects, right? Even if they're talking about these experiences, they're talking about them, but not necessarily knowing, oh, it's my metalinguistic awareness, which I think is neat. And so related to language brokering, we see that there are relationships between maybe language brokering being related to maintenance in the first language, but also motivations in learning a second or a third language. But there might be effects related to language dominance or proficiency. So as one participant who said, it was really hard, especially because I didn't know a word. If people are having difficulty in having to translate or interpret for their family members, they may not want to do it anymore. So then they may stop speaking the first language and engage in sort of language shift, which I think warrants additional investigation. But what I want to highlight here is also the idea of like strategy development. Again, bring it back to the age in which language brokers start to engage in these practices, about 8 years old. This is, I call this an important cognitive development era, but they're doing this at a young age and their brains are still developing. And how is that going to affect their problem solving and decision making? So what I want to highlight here as well is, even though this study was a qualitative study, a lot of the quotes that came out of this really got me thinking about, well, we know that language brokers are problem solvers and decision makers, right? They're engaging in these sophisticated like cognitive abilities and helping their parents maybe dispute an unauthorized charge on a bank account or a credit card, but they also might be engaging in these cost-benefit solutions. Say if their parents need to install a new internet plan, and we always get, like, even as adults who speak English fairly well, some of that language is very jargon heavy, and you're like, but I can get this 1-year account and it's $17 the first month, then $80 every other month. But then I get this other one that I pay $80 up front, but then it changes. Now imagine a child having to do that and interpret it for their parents, or filling out insurance forms, like when people have to choose their insurance yearly. So because we had a qualitative study, I was really interested in how can we look at this in an experimental way, and maybe take out the linguistic component, but still have a linguistic component. So this is what led me to some of my current work. I've become really interested in decision making, and how we make decisions, and for me in particular, I'm really interested in how language brokering experiences affect your decision making abilities. So doing research on bilingualism, we know that there's a lot of research on foreign language learners and when they make decisions, and that when you make a decision in a foreign language, those decisions are easier, and this might be because there's more distance in a second language or a foreign language, and there might be less intuitive bias in a foreign language. But I was interested in language brokers who are, for the most part, fairly early bilinguals. I was like, but they're not necessarily gonna have as much as the linguistic distance between their L1 and their L2. So I've decided to switch gears, and I have some wonderful collaborators, Chantal Ramirez and now Dr. Cayesano, and we were interested in, well, does language brokering experience affect decision-making? And so we examined decision-making abilities in Spanish-English bilinguals with varying brokering experiences across contexts using an Iowa gambling test. And we hypothesized that greater language brokering experience would lead to more cautious decision-making. And why we hypothesized this was, again, thinking about the emotional weight of having to make a decision. If you're making a really significant decision for your parents, you probably don't want to take a risky decision. You want the short decision, right? So, and I apologize, that's my dog scratching if you hear her. So what did we do? We tested 163 Latinx Spanish-English bilingual brokers. And here in table 1, I have their self-rated language abilities. And what you can see here is that our participants self-rated their English abilities significantly higher than Spanish. But to contextualize that, most of our participants are in Texas, and in their educational background, most of them K through 12 and now college, have done their education in English. So we wanted to control for that, and Chantal, who's a wonderful collaborator, was like, let's make a language dominance variable and just subtract their overall Spanish proficiency from their English to kind of create a range. And we didn't have any hypotheses about language dominance. We just included it in the variable as a covariate in our following analysis. And so what you can see here, our language dominance it ranged from -2 to 5.25, and the larger positive numbers, that means more English dominance, while the smaller negative numbers mean more Spanish dominance. And the average was about 0.75, and what we can see here is that it's slightly more on the English dominant, but a 0 would have been equal proficiency in both languages. And so we measured their language dominance scores, but we also had them answer a very lengthy language brokering questionnaire where we asked them, in what context did you broker, who did you broker for, and we have probably over 30 questions on language brokering, so we couldn't enter all of those questions into the model. So I ran an exploratory factor analysis to determine different brokering loadings. And for brokering people, we ended up categorizing 2 factors, one that we called brokering for family, which was like mom and dad, and then brokering for non-family, more like teachers, classmates, doctors. And then we also had places, because I really wanted to look at, is there an effect by who you translate for, the places that you're brokering, and then also the items. And for places, we had brokering in medical offices, brokering in formal settings, which is more of like government offices. So we wanted to distinguish government offices from like medical settings, because those are pretty different. And then casual settings, more like brokering at a restaurant. And then for items, we had brokering billing information, so like telephone bills, cable bills, and then brokering entertainment, more like, did you broker stories for your parents, movies, and then, or no, entertainment, yeah, television, and the narratives, that was more stories. Okay, so we had participants come into the lab, they did the questionnaire, and then well, first they did the experiment, then the questionnaire, but we had them do this experimental task called the Iowa gambling task. And this task has been used to capture reward versus risky decisions for patients with damage to the prefrontal cortex. And for this project, we used it to examine how language brokering experience may affect decision making. So we sat participants in front of the computer and we told them, today we're gonna give you play money up to $2,000. We had to tell them it was play money because they're undergrads. And we told them, we want you to we want you to win as much money as possible. And so we told them, you're gonna have a choice of 4 decks. And each deck had 50 cards each. And 2 of the decks were advantageous, and 2 of the decks were disadvantageous. And what that means is that advantageous decks, which were C and D, those always gave you a profit of $50, right? Those are the ones that are going to give you the most steady profit. But then the disadvantageous decks are more risky decks. So you could win $100 one round, but then the next round you might lose $200. Participants didn't know this yet. We just told them, you want to win as much money. I don't know when you'll win money. You might lose sometimes, you might win other times. And so on the keyboard, we're like, you were presented with the decks, and then we told them, okay, choose a deck, and say this person was like, I'm gonna choose deck B. And then they would get a screen and they would see that they won $100, and now their total was $2,100. And what we were measuring was how quickly they made their decisions. So we measured this in reaction time in milliseconds, and then we measured which decks did they choose. Were they choosing more risky decks or non-risky decks? I'll go through this quickly. And so we use linear mixed effects to analyze the reaction time and data, and then we use logistic mixed effects for deck choice. And this just kind of presents the variables in the model. So we used the subject as a random factor, subject and trial as a random factor, language dominance as a covariate, and then block, deck choice, and brokering for people. I'll only go over brokering for people because of time today, as fixed effects. And so our best fitting model is really big. So this just has the kind of important work. We found a significant three-way interaction between block 2, deck choice, and brokering for non-family. And I'll show a graph that can kind of explain what this means a little bit more, because we're still writing this up and we're still trying to figure out the best way to interpret this three-way. So here on the x-axis, I have the blocks. So each block was 20 trials. So we just kind of averaged them. And then on the y-axis, I have the reaction time. So how quickly did participants make a decision? And because it was a three-way interaction with brokering for non-family, and brokering for non-family was a continuous variable, we did a mean split of that variable to kind of group it. Right now we're trying to figure out what's the best way to interpret. Okay, and so we grouped them into like sort of high broker for non-family. That just means they brokered a lot more for non-family members versus low broker for non-family. And what we see here that's really interesting is that for the high, those who brokered significantly or more for their non-family members, there's not much variation in reaction time between risky decks versus non-risky decks, right? So and the reaction time for both groups gets faster as the trials go on. So this is showing some sort of learning or habituation, but for those who don't broker as often, in block 2, and we still need to run this, we think that there's going to be significant differences between these two groups. So and I'll get into some conclusions. What we're thinking is that the context of brokering for non-family members might make you maybe a more cautious decision maker, but you're also weighing your options a little bit more. If you haven't necessarily brokered as much, you might not necessarily care. To those participants, this might have just been an activity where like, I'm just picking decks. And I didn't show the logistic regression, but when we looked at deck choice as the outcome variable across context for brokering, we see that the more people brokered across different contexts, the more likely they were to choose non-risky decks, which I think is the most telling finding in this project, is that language brokering may make you a more cautious decision maker. And if we think about why that might be, language brokers may have grown up translating for their immediate family. So there are direct consequences when they're translating, right? If you pick the wrong internet plan and then your parents are paying significantly more per month, that's going to affect their income. And when your parents' income is affected, that's going to affect you as a child. So we're still writing this up, but we think these findings are very I think they're very interesting, and I hope to get some questions. But to kind of wrap up, because I want to be good with time, I do want to talk about some reflections of this work. And because I think work should always be changing and modifying as you learn new things. And I feel like I'm constantly learning new things from colleagues and friends and Twitter and other researchers. So I want to talk about how bilingualism is multidimensional, right? So brokering, just like bilingualism, isn't just a categorical variable that you're like, oh yeah, I brokered, awesome. And you put that into a model, but there are different contexts and types of brokering. And it's important to acknowledge those contexts and the variability in brokering, but also the emotionality related to language brokering. And I use this Baby Yoda meme because it's 7-year-old me trying to translate a document for my mom. Because it's an emotional experience, especially if you think about young children doing this, or delivering terrible news to a parent or a family member. Which I bring up the term centrality, which my colleague Soo-Young Kim has done a little bit of work on, where she talks about the importance of the experience. Because for some language brokers, maybe it was really important that they were a broker for their mom. Like they saw it as their responsibility. So there might be more emotional effects there, as opposed to someone who's like, I occasionally do that for my parents. So there's more distance in maybe who they are, what brokering is to them as a person. And what I'm thinking about in follow-up studies or future work is really diving into this idea, or thinking about brokering as a collaborative experience. Because sometimes it's not just the broker talking to the person that they're translating for, but the person they're translating for is also responding back to them. And if there is confusion or misunderstandings, they are going to have to work it out to figure out what's the best solution. And I also, because I started a lot of this work, especially in grad school, thinking about brokering as being this positive, advantageous experience, but it's messy. And it's not all positive, but it's also not all negative. And I think that's something that, for one, I'm going to constantly be asking myself in studies, but I think it's something to always consider, right? It's not one or the other, but it's there. I promise these are close to the end. So I want to highlight this because I think language brokering is a unique opportunity for us to better understand how an informal translation practice could have enduring and illuminating results. And because it provides additional insights and changes over and above just knowledge of 2 languages, right? These are bilinguals, they're using 2 languages, but they're also translating. And language brokering, I think, allows us an opportunity to examine the intersections of social, emotional, cultural, cognitive, and linguistic experiences in ways that can enhance our understanding of bilingual abilities. And it also expands our understanding of human language capacity and related capabilities, as well as any constraints across languages, cultures, and the lifespan. And because I really like Twitter, I always see brokering tweets. So Cristela Alonso is like, shout out to all immigrant kids who serve as translators for their parents, especially when you're a kid and have to and try your best to translate words you don't know yet. And then Erika Sanchez was like, shout out to all immigrant kids. It's stressful, but I learned to be assertive and get stuff done. And that's the end. I want to thank, and I'm especially happy because Dr. Vad's here. I wouldn't have known about brokering unless she told me, introduced me to the concept. My dear collaborator, Soo-Young Kim, my research assistants, and then my funders. And I'm on Twitter,